ABC General Hospital spoilers Wednesday, August 6 reveal that Lulu found herself spiraling into a place of desperation she never imagined. As the quiet unraveling of her son Rocco's emotional distance turned into a terrifying reality. What once seemed like a temporary phase of adolescent rebellion had morphed into something much darker, a total rejection of the parental roles that both Lulu and Dante once held so dearly. But what haunted Lulu most wasn't just the coldness in Rocco's eyes or the resentment in his voice, it was the feeling that someone, or something, had deliberately reshaped his identity. The warmth and safety once found in their home had been replaced with hostility and secrecy. In her deepest moment of fear, Lulu turned to the one person who could still reach across generations, histories, and trauma, Laura. Not just her mother, but a woman forged by fire, betrayal, and resilience. Lulu hoped Laura could help her pull Rocco back from the psychological cliff he was teetering on. Yet even as she made that desperate plea, Lulu could sense the overwhelming weight of what they were truly facing. This wasn't about discipline or communication breakdowns, this was about control. Lulu believed that someone was planting thoughts, rerouting values, and redirecting Rocco's emotions against the very people who loved him most. Her suspicions pointed toward Liesl, who had long been a controversial figure in Port Charles and whose influence over Britt, and potentially over Rocco, was more dangerous than most were willing to admit. But even Liesl, for all her madness and brilliance, didn't seem like the final architect of the damage. Lulu sensed a wider web at play. Perhaps something involving Britt's shocking return from the dead. Or the experimental and morally ambiguous world that surrounded her disappearance. Whatever it was, it had left its fingerprints on Rocco's heart and mind. He wasn't just becoming colder, he was transforming. And the mother and Lulu couldn't bear to stand by and do nothing. Laura, ever composed and sharp, immediately recognized the magnitude of the situation. She listened carefully as Lulu laid out the changes she'd witnessed, the dismissive tone, the lack of empathy, the calculated manipulation. The refusal to accept any form of guidance. This wasn't rebellion. This was indoctrination. Laura, with her decades of experience navigating political treachery, family breakdowns, and psychological warfare in Port Charles, saw the clues for what they were. Rocco wasn't just turning away, he was being pulled by forces determined to sever him from his roots. Together, Lulu and Laura began to quietly gather information, hoping to trace the path that led to Rocco's detachment. But the deeper they dug, the more tangled the truth became. Rocco had distanced himself from Dante with precision, and his bond with Lulu had eroded into barely concealed disdain. There were moments where Lulu could see him watching her like a stranger, analyzing her words, scanning her for weakness. That terrified her most. What if he wasn't trying to come back at all? What if he liked where he was going? Laura considered reaching out to Dante to create a united front, but Lulu was hesitant. The trust between Rocco and Dante had frayed so much that forcing a paternal reunion might do more harm than good. Instead, Lulu urged Laura to act from a place of strategy, not sentiment. Laura understood, if Rocco was being manipulated by powerful psychological conditioning, they needed more than love. They needed leverage, understanding, and if necessary, force. But Lulu was not without her own fears. The more she fought to reclaim Rocco, the more she feared she was losing herself. The guilt, the rage, the heartbreak, all of it twisted inside her, threatening to collapse everything she had rebuilt since her own coma. There were nights she couldn't sleep, haunted by the idea that she had already lost him. That no matter how hard she fought, she would always be the mother who wasn't there when he needed her most. She feared he had replaced her with someone else, Liesl, Britt, or even a constructed version of reality that no longer included her. Laura, however, refused to give up. She reminded Lulu that family wasn't just a bond, it was a war worth fighting for. And she would fight alongside her daughter until the end. Together, they developed a quiet but strategic plan to reconnect with Rocco. Laura would begin with public gestures, subtle reminders of their family legacy and what it truly meant to belong. Meanwhile, Lulu would approach from memory, using Rocco's childhood drawings, their shared photos, the music he once loved. The meals they used to cook together. Every little breadcrumb would be laid out carefully, hoping he might choose to follow them back home. But even as they implemented their plan, a greater danger loomed. There were whispers that Rocco had become involved in something far more dangerous than emotional manipulation. That his connection to the secrets behind Britt's disappearance, and potentially Liesel's medical projects, had turned him into a tool for something else. The idea chilled Lulu to her core. If Rocco had been co-opted into something bigger, then this wasn't just about saving a child, it was about stopping a larger storm from destroying them all. For now, Lulu could only hold on to one thing, hope. Hope that Laura's guidance, her own maternal instincts, and the truth would be enough. Hope that the boy she once read bedtime stories to, the child who once kissed her cheek and called her mama, was still somewhere inside the angry, guarded young man who now looked at her with suspicion. And if he was, she would fight, no matter how long it took, no matter how far she had to go. Because Rocco wasn't just her son. He was her soul. And she wasn't about to lose either. Sunny was beginning to see what no one else dared to admit. The pieces, long scattered and deliberately hidden, were slowly aligning into a terrifying mosaic of control, betrayal, and psychological warfare. For weeks, he had sensed something wasn't right: Anna's disappearance, Jason's silence, the erratic behavior of key players like Jocelyn and Brad. And now the chilling whispers about Britt and the truth behind her return. But none of it seemed coincidental anymore. Everything was converging, and at the heart of it all stood Brennan. Cloaked in institutional authority, wielding the full force of the WSB like a blade in the shadows. Sunny didn't trust many people, and when it came to international agencies like the WSB, his instincts were always sharpest. He began quietly pulling files, leveraging favors, and monitoring movements. What he uncovered wasn't just disturbing, it was explosive. Brennan wasn't just trying to keep secrets, he was orchestrating a silent war within Port Charles, one that included the manipulation of young minds like Jocelyn's, the forced compliance of figures like Anna, and the disappearance of individuals who got too close to the truth. And Britt's supposed death? Sunny now believed it was part of a much larger operation. Something that required faking lives, reassigning memories, and turning allies into unwitting agents. As Sunny dug deeper, he began to understand the twisted genius behind Brennan's agenda. It wasn't about power in the traditional sense, it was about resetting the board. Controlling who knew what, who acted on whose behalf, and who could be removed without question. He started to suspect that Brennan had been testing techniques on the emotionally vulnerable, people like Morgan, like Drew, like even Rocco. Each of them represented a potential tool in Brennan's arsenal, not because of their strength, but because of their trauma. Sunny had lived long enough in the mob world to know how powerful pain could be when weaponized. And now that he saw the outline of the battlefield, he knew he had to move fast. Brennan's grip was tightening, and Sunny couldn't afford to be reactive anymore. He needed to strike before Brennan made his next move. But the deeper Sunny went, the more dangerous the game became. People around him were beginning to act strangely. Brooke Lynn had come to him in confidence. Shaken and unsure about what she had heard at the Quartermain estate, conversations that hinted at mind control, experimental treatments, and coded communications between people she thought she could trust. Then there was Dante, who had reported inconsistencies in Anna's security footage before she vanished. And then Jason, whose silence wasn't silence at all, it was distance, strategic withdrawal, a signal that he was chasing a lead Sunny hadn't yet uncovered. But now Sunny was beginning to think that Jason's lead wasn't just about Britt, it was about the entire system that had let her disappear in the first place. What made the situation more volatile was the emotional undercurrent. Brennan hadn't just used people, he had broken them. Anna, once unshakable, had become isolated. Jocelyn, full of fire and independence, was now secretive and cold, clearly harboring something too big for her to handle. Morgan, long thought to be gone, was suddenly at the center of whispered rumors. Possibly alive and being manipulated. Sonny could feel the blood pounding in his temples every time he thought about it. If Brennan had touched Morgan, if he had dared to use his son as a pawn, then Sonny's retaliation wouldn't be measured. It would be absolute. As Sonny quietly gathered allies, Laura, Carly, even Trina and Emma, who had stumbled into the chaos through different paths, he realized he wasn't the only one seeing the pattern. The town was waking up. People were remembering conversations, noticing behavioral shifts, recognizing that too many things didn't add up. It wasn't just a few missing people or strange government ties. It was a coordinated psychological operation that had made Port Charles its playground. Brennan wasn't protecting national secrets, he was rewriting personal truths, turning lives into scripts he could edit or delete at will. But Sonny wasn't afraid of confrontation. He was afraid of not acting fast enough. If Morgan was alive and being used, if Britt was still out there and in danger, if Anna had been coerced into silence, then time wasn't on their side. Every hour Brennan remained in control of the WSB was another hour where the town's memories, alliances, and families could be dismantled. Sonny wasn't just planning a rescue, he was preparing a war. And it wouldn't be clean. There would be losses. There would be betrayals. But he would not stand by while someone tried to puppeteer the lives of those he loved. In private, Sonny began drafting a strategy. He instructed Spinelli to track unusual data traffic from the WSB servers. He reached out to Valentine, suspecting that his previous ties to the agency might help expose Brennan's chain of command. He even warned Carly, who was now fully aware that Jocelyn's involvement with the WSB might not have been voluntary. The revelations left her furious and protective. And that made her even more dangerous to Brennan's quiet domination. The circle was tightening. The town was stirring. And Sonny could feel that something massive was about to erupt. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about liberation. Brennan had built his empire through secrets and control, but Port Charles was a town built on survival, forged through pain, loss, and resilience. Sonny was ready to burn the entire operation down. The puzzle was no longer scattered. It was complete. And now, he was going to make sure Brennan saw every piece of it fall apart. Laura sat across from Dante, her voice calm but firm, her gaze steady as she pushed through a conversation she had been dreading for weeks. The air was thick with tension, not just because of the subject they were about to unpack, but because of what it meant for everyone involved, most of all, for Rocco. What began as a measured exchange quickly shifted into emotionally charged territory. And it became clear that Laura wasn't there just to discuss parenting logistics, she was there to draw a line. She believed that Rocco's future was being steered in a dangerous direction. One that was increasingly devoid of Lulu's legacy, and that realization terrified her. She saw in Dante a man overwhelmed, exhausted, and perhaps unintentionally allowing his grief and pride to push Lulu's memory into the background. It wasn't intentional neglect, but it was becoming systematic erasure. Laura wasn't going to stand for that. She reminded Dante that while Lulu still remained in a fragile state, she was alive. And her wishes as Rocco's mother could not simply be buried along with the life she once lived. Dante's reaction was immediate. His jaw clenched, his voice rose, and for a moment, all of his buried frustration spilled to the surface. He had raised Rocco practically alone for years now. He had made sacrifices, carried the weight, and weathered the storms. In his mind, he had earned the right to decide what was best for their son. But Laura's challenge cut through his defenses. She wasn't accusing him of failing, she was accusing him of forgetting. Of letting his own pain rewrite the narrative of who Rocco was and who he belonged to. And that accusation hurt in ways Dante hadn't expected. He lashed out, accusing Laura of being too idealistic, of projecting her own guilt for being absent during Lulu's worst days. But even as he spoke, a part of him knew Laura was right. The mention of Lulu's name had grown less frequent in their home. Rocco rarely brought her up anymore, and Dante had convinced himself that was for the best. That it made things easier. That it spared them both pain. But Laura refused to accept that version of the truth. She insisted that Rocco had the right to know his mother's story in full, her bravery, her intelligence, her flaws, and her love. And more importantly, Rocco had the right to be raised with the hope that one day, Lulu could return. Laura didn't want to take Dante's rights away. What she wanted was for them to come together. To reintroduce balance, to ensure that Lulu's voice still mattered even if it couldn't currently be heard. But Dante saw it differently. He felt ambushed, judged, and unfairly cornered. He didn't want to admit that the idea of Lulu coming back scared him, not because he didn't love her, but because he no longer knew what that would mean for the life he had rebuilt. Laura's push wasn't just about Rocco. It was about a reckoning he wasn't prepared for. And yet, as their conversation dragged into silence, something shifted. Laura softened. She reminded him that this wasn't a battle. This was a plea. A mother asking a father not to forget the woman who had helped bring their son into the world. She asked Dante to allow Rocco to visit Lulu regularly, even if it was painful. She asked him to let Rocco keep a photo of her in his room again. She asked that they stop pretending the past could be simplified. It couldn't. And it shouldn't. Rocco had the right to all the messiness and beauty of his origin. Dante's anger faded slowly, replaced by the ache of realization. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The conversation wasn't over, but something in him had shifted. Laura had planted the seed. Whether it would grow into a renewed alliance or deepen the rift between them remained to be seen. But one thing was certain, the future of Rocco would no longer be defined by silence. Chase and Michael stood face to face in the Quartermaine living room, the tension between them thick enough to cut through. The atmosphere had been building for weeks, but now, with Daisy's safety in question and Willow's emotional stability crumbling under pressure, the fragile equilibrium finally shattered. Chase, always the calm and measured one, had reached his limit. He could no longer sit silently while Michael continued to rationalize Willow's behavior, ignoring the very real danger she posed, not just to herself, but to others. The argument ignited when Chase brought up Daisy's recent breakdown, pointing out how Willow's secret surveillance had triggered a wave of fear and paranoia in the already unstable young woman. Michael, defensive and emotionally raw, refused to believe that Willow, his wife, the mother of his children, could be capable of something so reckless. But Chase wasn't interested in soft-pedaling the truth anymore. He reminded Michael that the same woman he loved had been hiding in shadows. Driven by an obsession with protecting her children so extreme that it had begun to mirror the very trauma she once swore to heal from. Michael accused Chase of lacking compassion, of failing to understand what Willow had endured since her cancer diagnosis, her estrangement from Nina, and the stress of raising 2 children while under constant scrutiny from Port Charles's ever-judging eyes. But Chase pushed back hard, reminding Michael that trauma could explain behavior but not excuse it. That turning a blind eye now could mean letting Daisy fall further into harm's way, or worse, letting Willow spiral into a place she couldn't return from. What began as a disagreement over judgment quickly spiraled into a deep philosophical divide. Chase argued for intervention, for therapy, even for temporary distance between Willow and the children until she could be evaluated. Michael called it betrayal. He saw it as an attack not just on Willow, but on their family unit, one he had fought tirelessly to preserve. But Chase knew the warning signs. He had seen them in other cases: paranoia, obsessive surveillance, flashes of aggression masked as maternal instinct. He feared that if nothing changed, the next outburst wouldn't just be psychological, it could be physical. As the fight escalated, years of unresolved tension between the 2 men surfaced. Their past rivalry over Willow, their different approaches to justice, and their moral codes clashed in explosive ways. Michael believed in loyalty, in protecting his own, no matter the cost. Chase believed in hard truths, even when they hurt. And as the words became sharper, more personal, it became clear that the real argument wasn't just about Willow or Daisy, it was about who each of them had become. Michael, once the principled son of Sunny, was now willing to blur every line to maintain control. Chase, once the forgiving cop, was now uncompromising when it came to safety, even if it meant standing against someone he once called family. What neither of them could admit aloud was the fear that haunted them both, that Willow was slipping away, and that by the time either of them did something, it would already be too late. In that moment, both men realized that the future was no longer stable. The ripple effects of Willow's unraveling, Daisy's trauma, and their own fractured alliance were beginning to spread, infecting everyone connected to them. This wasn't just about a mother making mistakes or a child in danger, this was about the very foundation of trust cracking beneath their feet. And in the shadows of the argument, something darker stirred, a sense that outside forces, perhaps even Drew or Nina, were pulling strings none of them could yet see. As their voices echoed through the Quartermain estate, the world outside Port Charles continued to shift, proving once again that no matter how tightly anyone tried to control their future, chaos always found a way to seep in. Danny was quietly watching from the corner of the gym as Rocco sat on the bench, his hands clenched, his face hard with frustration and confusion. For days, Rocco had been unraveling, struggling with choices that weren't his, with pressure that came from adults fighting for control over his life. The weight of being pulled between Lulu and Dante, of being used as a pawn in a battle he never asked to be part of, had taken its toll. And while the rest of Port Charles debated his future behind closed doors, Danny saw what no one else seemed to: Rocco was breaking inside. So Danny, without fanfare or expectations, approached him the only way he knew how, as a friend. Not with promises to fix everything or dramatic speeches, but with quiet solidarity. He sat beside Rocco, tossed a basketball between them, and waited. It was the simplest gesture, but it cracked something open in Rocco. There were no judgments in Danny's eyes, no agenda, just presence. And in that silence, Rocco began to talk. He spoke about how everyone treated him like he didn't know what was going on, how they fought over him instead of speaking to him, how it felt like his choices were being erased. And Danny listened. Then he reminded Rocco of who he was, of his strength, his resilience, and the truth that no matter how loud the adults became, his voice mattered too. In those moments, a bond formed, one born from understanding, not obligation. It was more than just comfort. Danny was grounding Rocco, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Their friendship began to solidify into something deep, something real. In a world filled with secrets, betrayals, and manipulation, they gave each other the rare gift of truth and trust. And as the days went on, Danny became the one person Rocco could depend on, a steady hand in the storm, a reminder that family isn't always defined by blood, but by the people who stand by you when the world starts to fall